Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC for short, is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, intellectual dialogue, and exchange of ideas and arts and culture. Today's session is The Man with a Story and a Song, the life and times of Girish Karnad. This conversation is to commemorate the legacy of a cultural icon, Girish Karnad, has also shared in his memoir, This Life at Play. The speakers will discuss the life-shaping experiences of this towering genius, which offers a unique window into the India in which he lived and worked. Today's event is in collaboration with Indian Cultural Forum. On the panel, we have Arshia Sattar, author and translator, Padmavati Rao, poet, translator, and theatre practitioner, author and journalist Raghu Karnad, Ramakant Joshi, editor and publisher Manohara Granthamala, Srinath Perur, author and translator. This session is moderated by Githa Hariharan, author and cultural commentator. The full bios of all the speakers will appear on a chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And through the session, if you have any questions, comments, or observations to share, please feel free to use the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of the Zoom screen to the left of the chat box. And with that, I hand it over to Githa.
Thank you so much, Lekha. Both the Bangalore International Center and the Indian Cultural Forum have benefited from their association with Girish Karnad. So it's appropriate that we should come together to celebrate, to remember Girish Karnad, the man, the work, and the legacy through his memoirs. Now, the memoirs called This Life at Play covers his life up to his early 40s. So even though the second half isn't there, there is enough to get a very clear idea of the many lives that he packed into that one life. And to talk about Girish Karnad's work through this book, to talk about his work as a writer, as an actor, as a director, as an institution builder, as a filmmaker, and most important in today's time, as an engaged citizen, we have a very interesting panel completely equipped to give us a rich range of insights. Let me begin with Girish Karnad, the writer. I remember an interview on Doordarshan, an old interview on Doordarshan with Anil Darkar, and when Girish Karnad said, when asked, how would he like to be remembered, since he led so many lives, he said, as a writer first, as a playwright first, specifically, as a playwright, then a director, and then an actor. So let's look at that playwright. The extraordinary thing about this memoir, This Life at Play, is that the very first page shows you the stuff of a good playwright. So in one page, you have the characters delineated into sort of complete little miniatures. Girish is there, his mother is there, his father is there. There are some ghosts as well, as there must always be in a play, people who are not on stage, but who are somewhere in the wings. The setting is quickly put together in one paragraph. You know, he's won awards, he's got a gold medal, you know, he's just been appointed director of an institution. And so the air is thick with his glory. Then, like a very fine writer, into this golden pool, he chucks a little pebble, because his mother says very casually, and this is very important because his mother's presence throughout the book. She says, oh, and to think we almost didn't have you. So this, you know, that one line of dialogue, actually in a humorous, lighthearted way, because the mother's reaction, the father's reaction, his own reaction, but there is this huge existential question. For a minute there, he thinks, what if I hadn't been born? Because it turns out that a doctor who was going to rescue his parents from him didn't turn up. So at the end, there is this very humorous solution also that many writers face when it comes to dedicating their books. So Girish must have suffered a little and thought, should I dedicate it to Saras or Raghu or Radha or, somebody else? And so this was excellent. So he's got a person we don't know, the unknown audience. So I just want to say that this is the kind of writer he is. And thanks to his own translation, as well as Srinath Perur's efforts, we get it in effortless English. The most important test, of course, is that you want to know more. And that, of course, is what all writers want to hear. Now, let me move to Arshia. We've talked about the results of a lifetime of nurturing his writing talents. But what was the foundation of his creative resources? So nobody better than Arshia to talk about those early years, the childhood bank of myths and tales and histories, the theater, the yakshagana, that actually fed into his creative efforts, but using myth in a very modern way. Arshia.
No, absolutely, Gita. Myth and legend and folklore stayed with him all his life. And, I really believe that his greatest plays are the ones in which he draws on myth and folktale. Other people prefer his historical plays, but also because of my own obsessions, I find his plays, Nagamandala for me, will never be matched by anybody. It's better than Kalidasa even. It is truly, truly a magnificent play. But I think what happened, but he wrote Yayati and then he took Hariharan, but somehow his association with Ramanujan, we met when he was a very, very young man, allowed him to transform what was basically stimuli into art. Yeah, and to make it, as you said, he's not repeating the stories. He's not doing the great, as we call them in India, mythologicals, of Yakshagana and all of that. He's infusing these stories with a little tweak here and a little tweak there with the spirit of modernity. And he is, the most exciting thing for me about his mythological plays is what he does with the women. When he writes Yayati in Mahabharata, in fact, I was just reading it yesterday, Mahabharata, the sexual tension between the women is, irrelevant. It's got nothing to do with anything. And he said once, he's like, I put the sex into it. But he created a dramatic tension that fuels the story and allows us to think of portraits of masculinity, portraits of femininity, who is a man, who is a woman, how are those people defined in the classical period? Do we actually treat each other any differently today? So of course it was the early years in Sirsi, in those malaria-infested swamps where, he had this wonderful childhood. He was running free. I mean, he went to Yakshagana, he went to somewhere else. And because till the very end, he was like a sponge, he absorbed everything. So he held all those memories. And then I think the meeting with Ramanujan and their great intellectual companionship and, brotherhood, actually, the two of them, transformed them both. And certainly it allowed Girish to use this material in very, very effective ways.
Yes, and I was struck in these times where myth is pushed away from people and made to be something awesome. He actually says that myth is a good way to be introduced to ourselves. So this kind of reflection of our sort of deep, dark desires and fears and so on. And you've mentioned Ramanujan, we should come back to him later, but I wanted to move on to Ram Joshi and say that, yes, there were these creative resources, but then there was also the creative community. And this is a word that we are going to repeat, I think, throughout this evening, the community. And Ram Joshi, we want to hear a great deal from you. So I'm going to be a little difficult and ask multiple questions. One, of course, is to give our audience an idea of Dharwad. And I'm going to say this because the kind of Dharwad that Girish and others describe, and which is now sadly known for the assassination of Kalburgi. So we want to look at that Dharwad again, where it was possible for people to, writers, mentors, aspiring writers, to meet in an atta and discuss what language to use, what to write about, and so on. And then for you to tell us something about your publishing house, Manohara Granthamala, which is so much a part of literary history. So it's a kind of three-in-one question, if you don't mind.
Yeah. My father, G.B. Joshi, who was the founder of Manohara Granthamala, he was a member of Gedayara Gumpu, which was established by D.R. Bendre, Dara Bendre, poet. In 1933, when Gedayara Gumpu, which had three important members, one was G.B. Joshi, another was Betgeri Krishna Sharma, third was Govind Rao Chulki. Betgeri Krishna Sharma had written the first novel called Sudarshana, which was to be published by J. When Sudarshana was ready for publication, Gedayara Gumpu was about to close for differences of opinion. So at that time, Shamba Joshi, another member of Gedayara Gumpu, he suggested that we can bring out the first novel of Betgeri Krishna Sharma, which was a very important first social novel. So at that time, GB was the person, and I must mention GB's dreams always. There is one book which is published by him called Jadabharatana Kanasugulu, Dreams of Jadabharata. Basically, GB was always in favor of creative writing in Kannada. He always persuaded writers to write in Kannada and think in Kannada. He was the man who almost created Kannada literature for the last 50, 60 years. He was the man who developed Manohara Granthamala into an institution. I must owe my obedience to my father. When Girish came to Manohara Granthamala in 1960 with his first play, Yayati, GB just read it and returned it with a comment that end is very nice. So when Girish left for England with having Rhodes Scholarship, he thought that he would never return to India and settle in England only. But after a few days, when Kirti, who is our literary advisor, Kirtnath Kutkoti, who had come to our house, and GB told him the story of Girish Yayati, and Kirti was very much fascinated by the play's idea, and he asked GB to get the manuscript. When Girish went to England, before he reached England, GB's letter was waiting for him to asking him to send Yayati play. Immediately he sent the play. Kirti read it And in one moment, he said, "This is one of the best plays in Canada." He said, but Girish, being a Konkani by his mother tongue, his Kannada was not that so well. So Kirti said, "I would like to rewrite Yayati." And thus he sent the entire book, rewriting Yayati, and sent it to Girish. Girish okayed it, sent it back, and it was published in 1960. Sriranga and so many other writers just criticized the play, but it had a great impact on the readers, and thus Girish became Manohar Granthmala's writer from that play. Then, when he was in England, GB went on pestering him to write another play. Girish collected lot of material about Tughlaq, and he brought out Tughlaq with the help of Kitty Basrur. And then he
Ram
sent
Joshi,
the
I
book.
think, yeah,
After
sorry.
looked back.
Sorry.
Yeah, tell me.
I'm sorry, your audio went off, so I thought we'll come back to you.
Yeah.
You've taken us up to that critical point of Yayati, which in a way brings him back and actually creates the Girish Karnad we know. Somebody who discovered the riches in the Kannada language, living in India and being fully engaged, though he enjoyed Oxford, as the book tells us. If I may ask Padmavati, we've talked about the creative community, but there is also the community or the teamwork that is involved in theater and filmmaking and so on. And you have been associated with Girish Karnad and his work at so many levels, as an actress, as an assistant director, as a translator. And we're going to do a whole section later on translation because there's so many translators here with us this evening. But if you could tell us what sort of experience was it to your very first film? I think it was Girish's film in 1978. So if you could tell us about that experience, and also what kind of teamwork happened on the sets, whether in films or plays, or when you were the assistant director for the TV series and so on.
Yeah, so as I was going through the book, one of the things I noticed, especially his narration about Ghata Shraddha and Vamshavriksha and all, and I said, my God, filmmaking is about men, money, and machines, which is what Girish used to say. And here it was fraught with this potential for conflict in the middle of all this collaboration and all that. And Girish gives us an insight into what's happening behind the scenes, but when it came to Vandanundu, of course, he was very squarely the director and established also by then. And I was just a 15-year-old, but I could see the kind of collaboration and that existed between him and Kitty. Kitty used to be at home very often. And in fact, I mean, there's a sweet dish I learned from Kitty, which I make to this date, And as I was reading the book, I also realized that how Kitty has contributed to a scene that is there in his play Boiled Beans on Toast, where this boy talks of, oh, the interview is just a formality. And that was something that had happened, actually happened to Kitty. So I think this sort of thing was there. dipping into real life experiences of the people who were around him. And as far as working as a team goes, I think Girish was extremely open, because imagine, I was just a 15-year-old when I did my first film with him. And as I think about 10 or 11 years later, when I was about 26 or 28, we were doing Malgudi Days. And Girish was acting. He was playing Swami's father, right? And Shankar Nag, the director, had come down with chicken pox. And being the first assistant on the sets, the responsibility of shooting fell upon me. And here I was suddenly having to direct Girish. And we had a space constraint, we had all of that.
Yeah.
And I was amazed at Girish. I was just amazed, because he never once made me feel like I was this little twit who was suddenly in the director's shoes, because he wasn't present and was in hospital. And he could have really overshadowed the whole thing and done it his way. But he said, no, you know what Shankar wants. You know the script backwards. You know what R.K. Narayan is saying. Just go ahead and do what you have to do. And that was Girish, you know, the kind of faith he placed in you, the kind of encouragement he gave you, that made for this team, the teamwork that actually materialized. It came from being, because he was who he was, the kind of person he was.
Well, you've spoken about the person. So let's go a little to the personal now with Raghu, but I really shouldn't use the word personal, because I'm going to talk about something which I think is terribly important for all of us today, which is his sensibility. We talk about Girish sort of, going from one world to the other, one community to the other, one language to the other, and so on. Raghu, what insights you have into the sensibility that allowed him to be rooted, which is of course a dangerous word to use these days, rooted but never parochial, cosmopolitan but never deracinated. So what would you give us some insight into that?
I would love to try and give you some insight into it. To me, that begins as a mystery for me as well. When I was reading this Life at Play as a manuscript, I was reminded again and amazed again at how much of a journey Appa had made, and how much ground he had covered, from having an upbringing in Sirsi of the 1940s or the Hariharan of the 1950s, to reach Bangalore in the 1990s, and then to be, to be a engaged, quite political and vocal inhabitant and citizen of India in the past 10 years. That's a great deal of ground to cover, and it's left me quite actually a bit humbled, not just at him, but at everyone who belongs to that generation who's made a similar journey. So so I mean, the childhood that when he describes in the memoir his childhood, it's just steeped in a kind of loving memory, in a kind of affection, even when he's being critical about it. And so sometimes I think that his intention was to write the full memoir of his life, and with Srinath we had to work with it. We had to turn it back into a full memoir of half his life, because he never did complete it. But really, I think that that isn't too much of a loss, because the critical years that he wanted to talk about and that are most enriching to hear from him about are those early decades in which his own sort of adventure in encountering a new ecosystem, in encountering cities and encountering modernity, was echoing was quite closely echoing something that was a national experience and an Indian cultural encounter with modernity. Whenever Appa taught, he gave many lectures about this, and in a lecture he could span what modernity meant in Indian culture going back to the 19th century, but a lot of that, whether he was talking about something that happened 100 years before he was born, to me, I always felt like some version of it was compressed into his life. What it meant to be born in the 1930s in Sirsi, and then to encounter Harvard, Bombay, London, Madras, to emerge as a liberal, sometimes a bit of a radical character, but for that liberalism to not be what we associate with the word liberalism at all anymore. The word liberalism is very much under attack these days, and we assume that it means that it comes from lacking roots and from lacking authentic cultural grounding. But in him, in this journey, and when you could see it told through this memoir, you see a kind of liberalism that belonged to that generation, that emerged in that generation, which is all about having very authentic, quite orthodox roots, in fact. So for me, growing up in Bangalore in the 1990s, my upbringing couldn't have been more different. It was almost the reverse. And sometimes I felt like my education involved doing the reverse of what my fathers did, what Appa did. But what I see in him is this particular kind of, maybe it's a Nehruvian liberalism. I don't know if that's the right word, but I'm sure any of you would be more familiar, would understand it a little bit better than I did, in fact.
Raghu, I also wonder whether it was a fruitful and productive relationship between both the individual past and the present, as well as the collective past and the present. In times when the past is distorted to either glorify or to outright create fake history. This is something important, and I think that the resulting sensibility is what led to his political engagement in the later years. This is not a half-life. As you say, these were those important sort of building of the substructure years. Let me go to the very specific aspect of multiplicity, which has been a theme again this evening, of languages, language and languages. We have several people here who can talk about it. But of course, I'm going to start with Srinath. Srinath, I must say that just as I began with saying that all you want is more when you read the dedication page, similarly, I never felt this was a translation. Of course, some of that credit goes to Girish for his writing, but a lot of it must go to you, because this must have been a particularly complex translation, collaboration first, and then a kind of posthumous composite and so on. Would you like to speak about it? You will have to unmute yourself. The translator must be heard.
So they must. Yeah, but if I can just continue on what Ram was saying about Yayati and what Raghu was saying about all these influences coming together and so on. A particularly significant moment for me is, I think, when he wrote Yayati. It contained so much of his life experiences until then, inspired by all the Yakshagana he had seen at when he was, as a child. And he was on the cusp of leaving for Oxford, and he decides to read the Mahabharata and finds the Yayati story. And he it bursts out of him in a language that he wasn't expecting to write in. He was expecting to be a poet in English. And part of the reason for that is that he's been watching Alkazi's productions of Anui's plays, which are again a World War II reinterpretation of Greek tragedy. And so these, I think that ability to have all those influences within a person and then to have a moment in which they burst forth, I think that captures a lot of the essence of that cosmopolitanism and that spirit. Yeah, about the translation, it was a fairly unique sort of translation project, I think, because it started in one way and it ended up becoming something else. Girish called saying that he wanted to he was working on translating his memoirs, and he had done a few chapters, and his health wouldn't let him do the others. So if I could help him translate, that is, translate some of the other chapters and send them over to him, he would edit it and put them, put together a manuscript and so on. But then he died quite soon after. He told me he wanted me to help him with the Oxford chapter first, and then the nature of the project changed entirely, because there were some bits he had written in English. There were the parts he had translated himself, and there were 6 or 7 chapters that I had to translate. And I thought of it not so much as translating from Kannada to English as translating from Girish's Kannada to Girish's English. So as I guess all of you know, a translator's output is usually a composite voice of the original author and the translator. But in this case, I felt that with such a well-known voice, and it was the story of his life after all, it was his voice that needed to shine through, really. And to that end, I studied interviews in English. I looked at lectures it delivered in English. And I sort of worked out a vocabulary that Girish used to talk about those, the concepts that he had. If he was writing about Oxford, how would he say it in English? How would he say it in Kannada, and so on? So I actually had a file that read GK vocab on my in the folder in which all the translation chapters were, being saved. And yeah. So the whole idea was to put myself in the background and come up with something that would ring true to his voice, which is really well known. So.
Well, Srinath, what I found very moving was I heard you say somewhere that you actually are learning more Kannada as you translate. And I was just thinking of Girish's experience with after Yayati. Ram Joshi told us how, somebody went through it. But that is your relationship with the language. Instead of sort of saying, this is my mother tongue and I possess it, but you learn a language, you learn to love it, you nurture your relationship with it. And of course, both Padmavati and Arshia would be able to tell us much more about that. Padmavati, I wanted to ask them, Srinath, of course, has translated Vivek Shanbag's novel and now Girish's memoirs. But you've translated several of Girish's plays in addition to other translations, and you've translated to Hindi. So you're a bit of a, what shall I say, multi-tongued person yourself. So, would you tell us what the experience of translating his plays was? Yeah. Did you work with him?
No, Girish just gave me a free rein, and he trusted me. And and I told him at the very start, I said, Girish, you have a vocabulary at your disposal. And it's all very well to say, the translator makes it his own and all of that. But I think the author has access to a vocabulary and he makes a certain conscious choice of a particular word. And that brings a certain flavor to his writing, which then needs to come into this other language so that you make the author available. So I think a translator really needs to put his or her ego in his pocket and shove it away. And I mean, that's the way I work. And I think Girish was in touch with that and he appreciated that. And I also wanted to add to though it means going back to what Arshia and Raghu was saying. One of the things that was also happening in England while he was there was that Bernard Shaw's plays were very popular and they were on the way down. And, then there was the war that happened and there was Joan Littlewood's, Oh, What a Beautiful War, and all of that happening. And like Srinath said, there were the Greek tragedies and all of that he had seen. And he did feel that this was something we could do with our myths and our stories, where we could move from the boredom of this living room drama and actually bring alive other scenarios and other spaces where drama actually happens. So I thought that that was something that influenced him a lot. And yeah, and coming back to translation, where I used to rely on his English work a lot, but sometimes I would often go to the Kannada because the English just didn't work for me in in Hindi, because the syntax and the grammar and the structure of sentences in any other Indian language is not quite like English. So it made sense to go to the Kannada and rely more on the Kannada. And so that was something I would do. And sometimes, like with Bikhre Bimb, after I had finished translating, we would have a reading. Arshia has been at one of those. And when we did Bikhre Bimb, and and we take suggestions, and we'd be open to something that needed tinkering. And yeah, so it was a very dynamic sort of process. So there was a back and forth that happened, but he left it to me to initiate that back and forth. It was never something he did in terms of trying to hover over me and ask, okay, is this done and is that done? I mean, even with Talikota, I was shooting for Hindi films at that point of time, and Girish wasn't keeping too well. And I was worried, and I wanted to just give him that reading. And I'm glad he got the entire reading of Crossing to Talikota, his last play.
I think perhaps the most important word you've used there is dynamic. You've raised the question of whether there is ever a perfect translated text. Arshia should be able to advise us on that, but also the fact of, in India, we have this dilemma of comparing what is called horizontal translation with the vertical translation. Basically, do we translate, say, from Kannada to Hindi, if you're lucky enough to know both languages, or do we go through the medium of English? And I think that's always going to remain a moot point, just like the slightly more, what shall I say, jingoistic Indian habit of saying that you'll never find an equivalent word in English for a word in Marathi or a word in Kannada. Of course, they're different languages. But I want to ask Arshia, who of course perhaps translates the hardest text of all, because it's sort of in the public, it's in the Reserve Bank of India of our cultural life. So Arshia, what did you ever have discussions with Girish on translation? And also, I'm going to use translation here in both the literal as well as the metaphorical way. In terms of looking at myths and actually sort of saying it nails me to the past, but, this play is not about gods. So when you're translating, yeah.
No, before I get to your specific question, when I think about Srinath translating the second half of the memoir, and I was thinking, what pressure, what amazing. See, I translate Valmiki. He's an imaginary being, right? Okay, let's say he existed. Nobody knows what he sounds like, right? But all of us have Girish's voice in our heads and in our ears. His literal voice, which you can still hear at Rangashankara, and his metaphorical voice, which is in his plays, and for some of us in his essays, and for many of us in his lectures, right? So for Srinath to be able to find that timbre, you know, and it's a very particular voice. It's a voice that you can recognize even out of context. It's like, oh, I know that voice. And I think that's true also of his literary voice. And I'm deeply, deeply admiring of what Srinath has been able to do. And also Pinti, Padmavati, you know, she is the perfect translator actually for Girish, because she speaks all his languages and she reads them, which is rare. And of course, she's worked with him since she was like 15 years old. So, and as she said, I've been at one of the readings for Bikre Bimb, and I was like, what is this? Yeah. I mean, it was so symbiotic. And it was so, as even at that time, as Pinti said, it's so dynamic. And in both, I mean, in other experiences also, again, as Pinti said, Girish's generosity was phenomenal. You know, this trust, take it, now it's yours. I'm not going to watch over you, you know. And he and I talked about translation a lot. And I remember one of the things he got really mad at me for in the early 90s. I said that, you know, Girish, you don't translate, you rewrite in English. And he said, how dare you? And I'm like, okay, done. You know, I was this little punk kid. I was like in my 30s or something. I can say whatever I want. And many, many years later, like 10, 15 years later, he said, I remember what you said. And I was like, oh, Jesus, man, it must have really touched a nerve. But I think, and Raghu and I have talked about this sometimes, you know, that when he translates into English, like Hariharan, you feel it very, very strongly. And in Nagamandala too, his locution is not English. He is bringing Kannada. He's bringing Kannada images. He's bringing Kannada pictures. He's not, you know, not so like obvious as, oh, here's a Kannada idiom, I'm going to translate it literally. He was actually bringing an entire visual and connotative universe with him when he was putting his own work into English. And of course, that's a privilege that only he has. None of us who would translate him would dare to play you know, with his words and his language quite as freely as we would. But I also, you know, the other lovely story that is in the memoir is how Karan, his other great collaborator, translated Tughlaq into Kannada, into Urdu, because there was a power cut in Delhi. It was the war or something. There was a power cut. So he sat by candlelight all night with a dictionary and translated it. But Girish also comes from a generation in the 60s, and we've had conversations about this. The point was to get the work on stage, right? So translate it. Don't spend hours. You don't spend days polishing and tweaking and saying, oh, this word and that word. No. Quick. And so many people were doing it. Dubey was translating. Pratibha Khaitan was translating. And Girish translated Eva Minderjeet from Bengali. How? Not possible. Right, but he used a Hindi translation, but it was so instrumental. It was such a functionalist approach to translation. Get it on stage. And these plays, you know, it was primarily men writing, of course, in the 60s and 70s, or the plays that get canonized are written by men. This is what created an Indian theater, you know, because, and the closest I've seen to it is Girish writes Nagamandala in Chicago, you know, in 1987 or something, in Kannada, right? Turns it into English himself. By the time I come back in 1990, Shankar and Pinti and Aru have done it. Neelam Mansingh has done a Punjabi version, even before the Kannada version came out, right? This is how theater moved. Yes. And this was the community. And I think that's very important to remember, because now we're so stuck in, oh, I'm doing Kannada theater, oh, I'm doing Punjabi theater, oh, you know, that has gone. Yes. So however much we want to kick down these national edifices, you know, national theater and national dance, this is what we're losing. And that is deeply tragic. So.
I think Arshia has brought us to a really important point, which is that creative community of effortlessly going from one language to the other. In India, languages do not have borders. How will you map them on the map of India? So people like Padmavati must be cherished, because you don't really have the multilingual practitioner or even the genuinely bilingual public intellectual anymore. So we can all say, yes, I can speak 5 Indian languages, but I can really only function in terms of large ideas in what we pretentiously call the father tongue. The mothers always get chucked out of the picture. But I also wonder whether this multilingual modernity, because we've been talking about myths and tale and legends, and we can't forget that Girish's project was not only to make those myths and tales and histories live in his framework of modernity, but he also wrote with urban themes, with with contemporary themes as well. So I'm going to suggest that the modernity had a kind of hyphenated character. You spoke of A.K. Ramanujan, Arshia. Ram Joshi spoke of those mentors who I think actually created the seeds of that modern conversation. So, we pay lip service to modernity as a kind of our groping towards it in India. I'm not even going to talk about postmodernity because we're still groping towards modernity. Thank God, because we don't want to try and unravel that. But Ram Joshi, if you could tell us something about the base of this modernity, because after all, there was the modernist movement in Kannada literature, and your publishing house was at the center of it. If you could tell us a little about the roots, and then we'll come back to modernity as in modern times.
One thing, GB always encouraged new writers. Write whatever you want to write, I will publish it. So in those days, Sriranga's Vishwamitrana Srishti, Sri Krishna Alanahali's Kadu, which was filmed by Girish later, and Bendre's documentary was first again directed by Girish. So many things associated with Girish for the last 6 to 7 decades. It is very, very difficult to point out which one, which not, and so many things. Girish, of course, he was so humble. He used to check his Kannada suitable or not, and then correct it. From his Konkani language, Konkani spoken language, when he writes North Karnataka dialect, naturally there were some things where he wanted to almost correct it with GBs. And Ramanujan, Girish, all these people are not as writers to us. They are our family members. GB always invited these persons to the house, to have lunch, to have dinner, to stay everywhere. Manohar Granthmala's Atta was a place where everyone would come, have dinner at high, and go to Atta and sleep all together in a line there. So it was a cultural movement in those days. GB was a personality who would make each and every one a family member and not as a writer and a publisher.
I'd like to add. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you tell me.
I remembered because I've seen GB and Girish working together on Vandanundu,
Yeah.
And because GB, he used to be there on the set, and I used to call him Tata. I used to call GB Tata because I was just 15, and he just, it was so amazing to watch how they worked on something together, you know, how they tinkered till they got it right. And the whole thing of the atta, Girish was good enough to take me when we went for the release. He took us to the atta and to the Dharwad house, you know. And I have to say this about Girish, when you, Ram, were talking about how humble Girish was. When we were shooting Vandanandu, Girish lived in a tent. When he had the choice to live in Belgaum in a hotel, in a posh hotel, 16 kilometers away, there were enough cars. The production had enough cars, right? But he chose to stay with the rest of the unit in a tent. And that made all the difference to the film.
Yeah,
But
I would like
to come back, Ram Joshi, to the publishing house, if I may interrupt, sorry. I must say that this sounds like the kind of publishing house that writers dream of and that we never find. But of course, as Girish points out when he's talking about his own life in Oxford University Press, that's only if sales are guaranteed. But I also wanted to ask, he was your literary advisor from 2003. What sort of advice did he have for what you should publish?
Girish, not only he wrote for Granthamala, but he also introduced new writers also to Granthamala. Whatever that he gets something new, he would come and tell GB, this is the new book, you publish it. Sri Krishna Alnali's card was published by us. I would like to mention one event when Kadu was being shot in Kankanhalli. In Kankanhalli, there was one just room. In that room, Girish, A.K. Beer, myself, and other 4 persons used to sleep on one bed. And we used to plan everything for the next day's shooting and then go to the shootings next day. This is how Girish always worked with his associations. For everything, he relied on the friends whom he had that much of faith in them. That is where, for all the 6 to 7 decades, Girish loyalty to GB and GB's association with Girish is one can't even imagine. I would like to just mention one thing. When Information Center asked Girish to produce Bendre's documentary, a documentary on Bendre, Karnataka government issued an entire documentary, and the last to Girish, Bendre, GB. That was the last shot, just going with Bendre GB team. Bendre said there were 3 monkeys on the tree. Girish said, shall we just take a shooting of it? Why? I'll call them. He just called the monkeys by their names, and all the 3 monkeys came down, took from Bendre's hand, and went out. Bendre and GB and Girish, 3 generations. But all 3 generations were only for namesake generation, all were equals. This is what GB almost said. Even though GB is my father, but he never looked and treated me as his son. I was always used to call him Mama, and he was a Mama to us. Girish, Girish throughout.
I just wanted to go back to that cross-cultural sensibility and the kind of hyphenated life he led, just like A.K. Ramanujan. And Srinath, would you like to reflect on this, as you were reading up on him, as you were translating his words, looking for his vocabulary? Did you get a sense of this strong cross-cultural sensibility?
Oh, certainly, yeah. For one, I was amazed by the number of languages he lived in, starting with multiple forms of Kannada. I mean, when he was in Dharwad, he had one kind of Kannada. When he was in Sirsi, it was another. And English, of course, and Hindi, and Konkani, and Marathi. And all those influences pouring into him in their own way. And of course, all of this being put together in that crucible of Oxford when he was, watching plays there and learning from, philosophers at Oxford and trying to make sense of the world he had left behind from that distance. And he had no idea when he would come back, or even, there might have been a small chance that he wouldn't return to India. So I think in that sort of distance, both physical and psychic, perhaps, his ability to come to terms, to have a reckoning with all the roots that he came from. And I think that was a particularly significant period of his life, and it perhaps shaped who he was, because that was when Yayati was published, and that was when he took the call that rather than emulate Eliot or Auden and become an English poet in England or the United States, he says somewhere in the book that, as Ram said, Sri Ranga criticized Yayati. And even that, he says that even to receive criticism from a playwright of his stature is a compliment of sorts. And he realized in England that he was never going to be able to, get that sort of engagement, that sort of intensity of response or affection there, and which, helped him make up his mind to return to India. And so I feel that is where these cultural connections were drawn. And he became the Girish that produced all those plays and films later on.
Can I
Srinath,
jump
you mentioned, yes, of course, Raghu, please.
It sort of sometimes makes me think that part of the way in which Appa was very resolutely an anti-chauvinist. He was not what you could call a nationalist in current terms, and he certainly didn't believe that people should be, that you define people by their natal origins in any way. Part of that probably comes from the fact that he really believed in language, and he believed in the ability to learn language and to inhabit different cultures through languages. So obviously the person he admired most, Ramanujan, was someone who could do that as a translator, as someone who could translate Kannada vachanas and then could go and translate Tamil Sangam poetry.
And write his own poetry.
And write his own poetry in English. And Appa himself was proud of his many languages, and he also had his own great life regret. His number one regret that he articulated in life was that in the time he spent in Madras at OUP, he failed to learn Tamil properly. Because then later on, he would also have to do some Tamil films and just kind of like rutto the pronunciation and not really know his lines. So I think he hated that. And the thing that I appreciate most about this is the non-chauvinism of it, is that he just truly admired scholarship. He admired real learning and real knowledge. It's why he was close friends with Arshia and many other people like her until the end, is because he loved people who loved learning. And his last play, you said, as you pointed out, you pointed about his memoir that he could have dedicated it to his family, but he didn't. Similarly, his last play, which he wrote when he was in the last years of his life, and it was in fact the English translation only came out after he never saw it published. It only came out after he died. that he obviously knew that was going to be his last play. And the dedication of that book, this is Rakshasa Tangadi, which in English is Crossing to Talikota. He reserved that dedication of his final play for a man that he never met, and another for two scholars. One of them is Richard Eaton at the University of Arizona, and the other is Krishna Kolar Kulkarni, who's a historian in Bijapur. And both of these scholars had basically done the work that enabled him to write this play, had done the research and the scholarly work and the translation. So his appreciation, even at that point, was mostly for them. And the first time he ever even was in touch with Richard Eaton was when he emailed him in order to ask if he could give him the dedication in this book. And I think for me, that was very touching that, at the end of a life that distinguished, when your final play is going to have the weight it does, you don't give the dedication to anyone nepotistically or sentimentally. You just have it reflect how much you admire someone's scholarship and their contribution.
And Raghu, you spoke of languages, his Girish Karnad's relationship with languages, but also language with a capital L. And I do want to bring in an important point we haven't touched on so far, but of course, in his later years, in fact, from the 90s, this is the Girish many of us knew. The last time I heard him was in 2018 when there was a writers' meet for tolerance. Just the name of the meeting gives you an idea of the mad times we live in. And Girish said something very important about language because he knew the relationship between language and action. He said, we are hearing a new ugly language now when there are words like lynching, urban naxer, tukde tukde. So these are ugly words which come and colonize our day-to-day lives and change the way we look at each other, and is in direct opposition to this kind of lifetime of working at plural ways of seeing, whether through language or genre, but that openness that should characterize Indian modernity, the hyphenated life, etc. I actually am feeling a little greedy about hearing Arshia talk about the two hyphens in different continents, but very close friends. And Girish Karnad, of course, made sure that Ramanujan's poetry reached us through OUP, the English poetry. So I think it would be very interesting to remind our audience, our friends who are listening to us, that it is possible to be Indian, but it is possible to be a really good Indian if you are hyphenated. Could you tell us about these two?
Thanks, Gita. I was dying to say something about Girish and Ramanujan, and you must have got the vibes. Actually, the first time I saw them together was in 1986, because Ramanujan, through the Festival of India budgets and all of that, he'd organized this big literary conference in Chicago for Indian writers. And Nissim Ezekiel was there, and Nirmal Verma was there, and Anantamurthy and Girish and everything. And we had, of course, a special screening of Samskara. And Girish and Raman and Anantamurthy were all talking about it, right? And I will never forget this. There was the three of them. Girish, of course, is taller than Raman and Anantamurthy, but they were standing at this lectern, and they had linked arms, and they were talking to each other in Kannada and laughing, and they looked like little boys. They were so happy to be together again, so happy to be together around Samskara. And I was 25 or 26 or something, and I was like, this is the holy trinity of Kannada writing, but of course also of Tamil writing and English and so many other things. And it's an indelible memory. But when we were all talking just now, from what all of us have said, I'm suddenly seeing Ramanujan and Girish as two sides of the same coin. I think they both wanted to be each other, and I think that's what cemented their friendship. I think Raman would have loved to be, known for his creative writing, and Girish said that I think he says in the memoir as well that Raman wrote a couple of plays and they were really terrible. And we have one short story that Ramanujan wrote, Annaya's Anthropology, which of course is anthologized everywhere. And as Raghu was saying, Girish was an intellectual, whatever else he was. He loved learning. He read big fat books. He, when he talks about writing Tughlaq, how much work he did. I mean, Raghu, you saw even for Talikota, how many books, yeah, in Kannada and in English. So he would have loved Ramanujan's life in some way, the sort of the Indian intellectual at the University of Chicago. And he's not like Tom Stoppard, where the intellectualism overwhelms the drama of the play. But Girish's plays are very, very cerebral in many ways, right? So I think that also bonded them. That they became the other in that place, So Girish was, in a strange way, Ramanujan's soulmate in India, and Raman was Girish's in America, and they both drew enormous credibility from their relationship with each other and from their constant interaction, and they were both just so open and so generous with each other. It was, they really believed this is our work, and the project of modernity was also a shared project between them, and I think that's very important and to remember. And there are so many criticisms that have been in the past, and there continue to be criticisms of Girish and Raman, like, oh, they are Brahmins. But these are the two guys who really deconstructed Brahmanya, as did Anantamurti, right? So, and that also was part of their project. They were not unself-conscious about privilege, about elitism, about caste, their own privilege, they're all of them, right? And they opened it up in ways that they created spaces that we now enter and occupy and say, oh, we are against this, and oh, we are for that. But it was created among other people by these men, and their confidence in each other. They supported each other so completely in their intellectual and psychological adventures. It's not to be forgotten, really. Yeah, and not to be repeated. Yeah.
Yes. I'm going to ask one last question. I hope our audience will not be furious, but after that we'll look at the questions. But to come back to future plans, Raghu, I found a kind of, I hope it's not far-fetched, but I found a parallel between your grandmother's memoir, which is just 30 pages long, but she's, of course, a significant presence throughout the book in a way. And again, quite by accident, Girish's memoir ends at, in his early 40s. And both, of course, are selective because, what do you want to say about your life? That's very important, So I want to ask you, what do you and perhaps Srinath have in mind? The afterword, which I think speaks with Girish's vocabulary and yours, a kind of Karnad family vocabulary. Is there any hope that you and Radha will write expand the afterword or into a biography, or is that a project that we should not think about now till we've all read the memoirs carefully?
I feel like I should give a very efficient answer to this. I do think that there is great scope for someone to write a biography of him. It could illuminate a lot of things that fall outside the memoir. It's not going to be me. It should be someone a little bit more objective. There's an incredible just his life of politics and activism
Absolutely.
would be worth writing a short book about. The journey that this community that we've been talking about made through the years before the Babri Masjid, having seen that cultural travesty take place, and then coming back to Karnataka and having trying to put out fires that got lit at places like Baba Budangiri Shrine and so on. This is like a whole other cultural epic that needs to be written and shouldn't be forgotten. And there are some very, very inspiring moments in which Appa was one of many players in the 1990s, when there was a much more robust feeling and a much more robust resistance against hate politics, which now, he died a month after this new cultural regime was reinstated in 2019. And I think part of the depth of the grief that people expressed was a big part of it was this sense of loss that we could not, just how painful it was to lose him among other men, among other people who were these like anchors against this violence and this thing. So yeah, so that's sorry, but that's one chapter or one book that deserves to be written. You could also write a whole book about him through the lens of language. I wanted to tell Pinti that it's fascinating to think about translating Bikre Bim into Hindi, because Bikre Bim itself is this culmination of his thoughts about language and bilingualism and conflict. Within that play, one language has to address its insecurities about another, Kannada and English. And then he wrote that play in two languages and to be performed sort of in parallel in Kannada and in English. And it's a fascinating little melting pot of language issues. Someone should definitely write his biography.
Yep.
There are great papers. He wrote a diary every day of his life. And for now, my sister and I wrote a short afterword so that there is something to carry readers on after the midpoint of his life. And so that certain critical aspects of his life, above all, his political beliefs, his very unwavering, very uncompromising defiance of hate politics and Hindutva, we wanted that to be registered in this book as well. So for now, it'll do, but there could be much more.
I'm glad you ended with that, because that's exactly what I wanted to say before we look at questions, which is that there was all this rich work, but the work fed into the man. He obviously believed in those values that he was writing about. He obviously took those questions he addressed seriously, because neither poor health nor being on a hit list stopped him from saying what he believed in, stopped him from actually standing up for the kind of modern India that he wanted. So let me look at some of the questions. A lot of people have been patiently waiting. Yes, one question has already been addressed, which is about a later memoir from his notes or papers. Happily, Raghu has answered that.
Also, it's worth adding for people who are curious about the memoir that he did write a series of chapters that were all mostly incomplete, and Srinath had to look over those. He sent those to Srinath, in fact, with an intention that it would become part of a full life memoir, but they just weren't ready. So all of that is there as material that hopefully will someday take some other form.
Somebody wants to know whether there was a difference in translating the memoir and the plays. We have a bit of a problem here because we have two different people, so they can't really compare. So I think we will skip that. But there is a question about the title. This Life at Play and its translation from a line from, I think, from Bendre's poem. Srinath, would you like to take that question?
Yeah. So one of the things I was thinking about when all this discussion about multiple languages and Girish's cultural world was happening was that in the memoir, he finds multiple occasions to hold his plays in Kannada and read them out in another language. And I was left very impressed by that particular feat of translation and the fact that he lived in a world where it was necessary to do that all the time, seemingly. Yeah, about the title. Well, I guess it comes from a line in a Bendre poem, which goes Nod Nodta
Dinamana.
Nod Nodta Dinamana Adartha Ayushya. And yeah, I think I translated that line somewhere else as, a day goes by in the blink of an eye, this lifetime I'd play. And yeah, I think the crucial aspect was to have it work as a title to the book rather than as a faithful translation of the line from Bendre's poem. And so, yeah, so I think this Life at Play seemed like a good choice for title, and our agent Shruti Devi, I think she inserted the this, if I'm not mistaken. I think we were talking about a life at play, and different variants. And I think she said, how about this life at play? And that stuck.
Mm-hmm. There's a question for Raghu. Have you considered getting Girish Ji's works translated into Nepali? I've been willing to do it for some time now. So that's, of course, marvelous. And I hope the person will contact you. I see no reason why the work shouldn't be translated into any number of languages. Let me see. Aparna Darwadkar says, I framed my question about an energetic performance culture before Arshia commented on it a few minutes ago. All the more reason to get a sense of how Karnad, the playwright, is being perceived now across the active theatre languages. Padmavati, would you like to say anything about that?
How he's being perceived currently?
Yes. In the theatre world.
I think one thing is very clear. I mean, Girish's excellence itself, makes him stand apart and tower over the rest. For example, if I'm to take an example, Ramanujan told Girish and Kambar the story. Girish wrote Nagamandla, Kambar wrote Siri Sampiye, right? And the reception of those plays is there as evidence. Though I have to mention here that, having said this, that Girish respected Kambar immensely, because I remember we were on a train. I can't remember where we were going, probably Dharwad. And he said to me that Kambar has Saraswati residing on his tongue. He said this about Kambar. I mean, that's the kind of mutual respect. So about how audiences, hold him currently, I think he has a certain relevance, because Girish did not stick to just myth and mythology and folktale, right? He moved with the times. He wrote something like Boiled Beans on Toast. It wasn't only about historicals. Boiled Beans on Toast was extremely relevant to the current day scenario and what is happening with the IT world and what's happening to the individual in that world, and also what's happening on a larger scale to the environment and how we are all placed within that and how we contribute to it, both positively and negatively. And I think his unflinching authenticity when it comes to his opinions, which he puts forth through his plays, I think that will always keep him relevant with audiences.
Thank you.
Can I say something, please,
yes,
Githa? Just to add to what Pinti is saying, the thing with Girish's plays, whether you're looking at the mythological plays or the historical plays, they're never only about that thing. They're always metaphorical. They're so multivalent, right? So what happens with a Karnad play is it never gets dated. I mean, Girish has been writing plays for 50 years, 5 decades, right? Mohan Rakesh is not sounding so good anymore. Even the mighty Tendulkar, you watch Sakaram Banda, which is a great play, and you're like, this is a period piece. That will never happen to Girish's plays. And I think anybody who is, a real theater person will just see that. So I think he has a longevity that is remarkable. I mean, it is much more so than any of his contemporaries in any of the decades in which he wrote in any language. I said once to Saras, and she said, "Oh God, I'm so glad Girish was not here to hear this, because he's like Kalidasa. He's our times Kalidasa." And she said, "He would have loved it. He's so vain. He would have loved it." But I think it's true. I think it's absolutely true. There has not been a more effective and influential and playwright that we will experience in our lifetime. That's for sure. So.
There are a couple of specific questions. One is, what was his relationship with Konkani? Which actually is quite an interesting question. Did he ever consider writing in Konkani, regardless of script? Ram Joshi, you might be best placed to tell us, did he leave Konkani behind at home?
Yeah, they used to talk Konkani at home. But once he comes out of the house, he used to talk Kannada because he was in Karnataka College. He was in Dharwad. So naturally, he has to speak Kannada. So in that sense, he always spoke Kannada. And that too, North Karnataka language, not a Bangalorean language. And one more thing which I would like to mention here
Please.
Is GB always told him, you write plays with mythology, historical and other things. You can't become a playwright until and unless you write a social play. So finally this challenge was taken by Girish. He wrote Bendakalu on Toast and Maduveya Album. These two plays are social relevant plays.
Yes. There's also a question about Girish's life as an actor. There are so many aspects we could not cover. We ignored the publishing period, though I enjoyed it very much because I was in publishing myself. But about his life as an actor in different sorts of films, either Raghu or Padmavati. Raghu, how did he look back on the very, very different roles he did? I'm hesitating to say commercial cinema because I think that's really insulting. Everything should be commercially viable so that we can eat, but in different kinds of films.
Well, what you just said about commercialism reminds me of a line that he used to enjoy. I think he enjoyed provoking people with it. It's a line of Marshall McLuhan's where he would say that art is just entertainment that's lost its audience. He could be quite highbrow, but he wasn't snobbish about anything, and thus his life in commercial cinema. He's quite explicit about it in the memoir, and his life at home always expressed this, that he never saw himself very much as an actor. He didn't relate very deeply to his commercial roles, and he didn't speak about that very much when he came home. The friend circle he had was much more a literary and a scholarly one. And he also used to say that his favorite thing about being on set is that it was so time inefficient that it gave him a lot of time to read. So it was his favorite place to read, is sitting on set waiting for a take to be announced. But I'm sure Pinty saw a very different side of this, because we just got to hear him making fun, lightly making fun of his acting career.
Do tell us, Padmavati, because I think in different parts of India, for a lot of people, the actor Girish Karnad is quite important. So I think we should address this question.
Yes. So Girish was very aware of the popularity he had received, especially when Swami came out. Swami, the Hindi film. Now there's Malgudi Days Swami also, which was popular, and he played the father in that. But the Hindi film Swami got him a lot of fame, and he was extremely aware of it. But he was also very clear that commercial cinema was something that he would do to bring in the pennies, and his first love remained theater. And as long as that fueled this and fed this, it was fine. Because I remember being part of conversations with Shankar, where Shankar also had become very popular on the Kannada scene in cinema. And he used to tell Shankar, go ahead, do it. Because Shankar used to say, oh, it's not making sense. And he would say, just do it. It'll give you the time and the money to do what you like to do, you know. And that was how it really was. There were no two ways. Theater was just something he was devoted to, and he dedicated a lot of his time and mind space and a lot of his love to that. Another thing I wanted to say was that in the book he talks about silent indebtedness coming full circle. You know, Girish was someone who, and this comes out in the book, he acknowledged people who had contributed something. So when a Satyadev Dubey did not mention something, or Karant did not, but he's made the effort to mention it, and then he's not shying away from being ruthless in talking about it, which could well be held against him. But if you look closely into what he's saying, he does say that there's this silent indebtedness coming full circle, you know, and I think that plays out in the way he held the role of cinema in his life too. I don't think he was ungrateful for its presence in his life. Yes, he may not have attributed much of his engagement, intellectual engagement with it, but sure, he acknowledged it.
I'm going to sort of sum up all the insights we've heard this evening in a very simplistic way, but I think Girish would have approved what these lives at play that we have been exposed to in this book, This Life at Play, tells us not only about deep friendships he made, and we've mentioned only one or two among the numerous people he talks about, the relationships with languages, with the genre, but above all, I think the humor, the playfulness, because without that, life and books and everything else would be terribly depressing, and the other critical component of our lives, which is hope. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining me this evening.
Thank you.
While looking for an apt title for this session, one remembered the man in the prologue of Nagamandala trying to escape a curse, looking for something to keep him awake, to escape it. While of course it is an amalgamation of folk tales from one of Ramanujan's collections, I can say without a doubt that the stories and songs that came from Girish have kept generations and will keep several generations awake through several nights, yours truly included. On a different note, Girish gave BIC wise guidance as a board member as we built our new premises, particularly the auditorium that bears his imprint. This discussion has left us thirsting for more Girish, the playwright, the actor, the activist, and one does hope that that biography materializes. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time and for joining us, and for building this beautiful, looking back at that lovely memoir. Thank you, audiences, for joining us. And all I can say now is good night and see you next time.
Thank you.